You are listening to insane HOA madness. She treated my car like community property. You are making this worse for yourself. The tow driver asked for paperwork, and Karen yelled that her word was the paperwork, and that was how enforcement worked. Light drizzle slicked the pavement around us and made the tires shine under the amber truck lights. Joan Walker stood 3 feet from my bumper with a handheld radio pressed to her mouth like she was calling in an airstrike, and I held my phone out between us, showing a time-stamped clip with the screen brightness turned all the way up. I am a realtor. I moved to Huntsville, Alabama 6 months ago because the market was heating up and Hidden Creek Reserve Association looked clean on paper. I know the neighborhood rules too well now. What is at stake for me is keeping my home insurance stable, and the HOA is pushing me toward a claim I cannot afford. Joan is the welcome committee chair. She weaponizes move-in rules. Tonight, she decided my temporary paper permit in the windshield was invalid, and she dared me to prove otherwise. The tow driver looked at the permit, looked at Joan, looked back at me. He said, "Mom, this is a valid Alabama temp tag." Joan cut him off. She said, "I have all day, and so does my fine meter." She tapped the radio twice like she was keeping score. I said, "You are on camera right now." Joan smiled. She said, "Your paperwork is cute, mine has a letterhead." That line landed hard. She thought she owned the moment. I let her talk because every word was helping me. The conflict started 3 weeks earlier. I parked in my own driveway with a paper permit visible through the glass. No plate yet, just the dealer temp tag the DMV told me was legal for 30 days. I came home from showing a property and found a bright orange sticker on my windshield. No readable text, just a giant violation shape. I peeled it off and called the HOA office. The woman who answered said, "You need a resident decal and a guest pass system even for temporary registrations." I said, "That is not in the CC&Rs. She said, "It is in the enforcement addendum we passed last quarter." I asked for a copy. She hung up. I pulled the covenant documents I got at closing. Nothing about temp tags, nothing about guest pass systems for your own car. I walked to the clubhouse the next morning and knocked. A security guard hovered near the door but would not let me in. He said the office was closed for compliance training. Joan showed up while I stood there. She wore a pink cardigan with the hood up even though it was 70 degrees, and she had a badge clip with a blank face hanging from her pocket. She said, "Can I help you?" I said, "I need the enforcement addendum." She said, "It is internal." I said, "Then how am I supposed to follow it?" She smiled and said, "That is why I am here." She walked me back to my driveway. She pointed at my car and said, "This is a guest vehicle until you register it properly." I said, "I live here." She said, "Not according to my scanner." She pulled a handheld device from her cardigan pocket and waved it near my bumper. It beeped. She said, "See?" "No resident code." I said, "Because I do not have the decal yet." She said, "Exactly." Joan handed me a slip. She said $75 for invalid parking, $50 for no decal, $25 processing. Payable within 5 business days, or we escalate. I said, "Escalate to what?" She said, "Tow on site." I said, "You cannot tow a car in someone's own driveway." She smiled. She said, "I have all day, and so does my fine meter." I called a real estate agent I knew from my brokerage. Her name was Marcy. She had been in Huntsville for 12 years and knew every HOA horror story. I told her what happened. She said, "Hidden Creek is brutal right now. Joan took over the welcome committee last year and started inventing rules. She uses vendors who do not ask questions. If you push back, she files a lien." I said, "Over a temp tag." Marcy said, "Over anything. She is trying to build a case that you are non-compliant so she can hit you with legal fees. Do not pay the fine. Gather proof and fight it at the next board meeting." I started documenting. I drove through the neighborhood that afternoon and took photos. Every third driveway had a car with a temp tag or a guest pass on the dashboard. None of them had stickers. I saved the images in a folder. I pulled the county registration database and confirmed my temp tag was valid through the end of the month. I printed everything. The next morning, I found another sticker on my windshield. This one was red. Still no readable text, just a bigger violation shape. I peeled it off and saw Joan walking up the street with two people in bright yellow vests. They carried clipboards. Joan pointed at my car and said something I could not hear. One of the helpers wrote on the clipboard. I stepped outside. I said, "What is this?" Joan said, "Compliance sweep. We are verifying all vehicles meet code." I said, "I already told you this is legal." She said, "You told me. I need documentation." I said, "I have documentation." She said, "Then bring it to the office." I said, "You would not let me in yesterday." She said, "That was yesterday." I grabbed the folder and followed her to the clubhouse. The security guard was gone. Joan unlocked the door and walked to a desk covered in papers. She said, "Let me see it." I handed her the temp tag printout and the county registration confirmation. She looked at them for 5 seconds and said, "This does not prove residency." I said, "I closed on this house 4 months ago." She said, "Then where is your deed?" I said, "In my safe." She said, "Convenient." One of the helpers leaned in and whispered to Joan. She nodded. She turned back to me and said, "We are going to need a full compliance package. Proof of insurance, deed, residency affidavit, and a notarized guest declaration." I said, "A guest declaration for my own car." She said, "Until you provide the package, it is classified as guest parking. Guests are limited to 72 hours per quarter. You are over the limit." I said, "That is insane." She said, "Your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead." She opened a drawer and pulled out a pre-printed form with a logo at the top. No readable text, just shapes. She said, "Sign this and we can start the review process." I scanned the form. It was an acknowledgement of violation and a payment authorization. I said, "I am not signing this." She said, "Then we proceed to step 2. Step 2 turned out to be a vendor sent to my door to verify parking compliance and provoke a reaction. I got home that evening and found a man in a reflective vest taking photos of my car from every angle. He had a camera with a long lens. I said, "Can I help you?" He said, "HOA compliance audit." I said, "Who hired you?" He said, "Management." I said, "What management?" He walked away. I called Marcy. She said, "They are building a file. They will use those photos to claim you were warned multiple times and ignored it. When they file the lien, they will add inspection fees and enforcement surcharges." I said, "How much?" She said, "Last case I saw was $4,000 for a parking violation." I said, "That is extortion." She said, "That is Hidden Creek." Joan left a voicemail the next day. She said, "This is your final courtesy notice. We have documented 17 violations over the past 2 weeks. You have 72 hours to submit the compliance package, or we will authorize a mobilization. If you have questions, you can reach me at the clubhouse between 9 and noon on Tuesdays." It was Thursday. I had 72 hours and no way to reach her until the following Tuesday. I went to the clubhouse anyway. The door was locked. A sign said the office was closed for board planning. I knocked. No answer. I walked around the building and saw Joan through a window. She was sitting at the desk eating lunch. I knocked on the glass. She looked up, smiled, and waved. I called the management company listed on the HOA website. The receptionist said Hidden Creek Reserve Association was self-managed. I said, "Who do I escalate a dispute to?" She said, "The board." I said, "How do I contact them?" She said, "Through the welcome committee." I hung up. That night I got an email. The subject line was "Enforcement Update." The body said the HOA claims a new enforcement wave starts at midnight, and Joan is using the clock like a weapon. After midnight, all non-compliant vehicles would be subject to immediate immobilization or tow. No additional notice required. I checked the timestamp. The email was sent at 11:45. I printed the email and added it to my folder. I also started recording. I set up a small camera on my porch aimed at the driveway. If they tried anything, I would have it on video. Midnight came and went. Nothing happened. I went to bed. At 6 in the morning, I heard a truck. I looked out the window and saw a wheel-lift tow truck backing into my driveway. Joan stood on the sidewalk with her handheld radio. A man in a safety vest climbed out of the truck and walked to my car. I grabbed my phone and ran outside. I said, "What are you doing?" The driver said, "Tow authorization." I said, "From who?" He pointed at Joan. She walked up and said, "Vehicle is in violation of code. Resident was notified." I said, "I was notified 15 minutes before the deadline." She said, "You were notified weeks ago." I said, "With rules you made up." She said, "With rules the board approved." I said, "Show me the board vote." She said, "I have all day, and so does my fine meter." The driver looked uncomfortable. He said, "Mom, I need the authorization paperwork." Joan said, "I have it." She pulled a slip from her pocket. The driver took it and frowned. He said, "This expired 3 months ago." Joan said, "It auto-renews." The driver said, "Not according to my dispatch." He pulled out his phone and made a call. I kept recording. Joan stepped closer to me and said, "You are making this worse for yourself." I said, "How?" She said, "Every day you delay compliance, the fees compound. You are up to 600 now." I said, "For what?" She said, "Violations, processing, vendor time, and obstruction." I said, "Obstruction." She said, "You are interfering with enforcement." I said, "I am standing in my own driveway." She said, "You are preventing access to a non-compliant vehicle. That is obstruction." The driver hung up. He said, "Dispatch says the contract is inactive. I cannot tow without an active work order." Joan said, "I am giving you the work order." He said, "You are not my client. The HOA is. And the HOA account shows no active service agreement." Joan stared at him. She said, "Call your supervisor." He said, "I just did. That is who told me to stop." Joan turned to me. She said, "This is not over." She pulled the radio up and said something I could not make out. Then she walked away. The driver looked at me and said, "You might want to get a lawyer. This smells bad." He climbed back in the truck and left. I called Marcy. I said the tow vendor's contract actually expired months ago and they have been towing on pure bluff. Marcy said, "That is fraud. You need to file a complaint with the state contractor board and the county. If Joan has been authorizing tows under an expired contract, she is personally liable." I said, "Can I use that in the HOA meeting?" Marcy said, "Absolutely, and I will come with you." The next board meeting was 2 weeks out. I spent the time gathering everything. I pulled records from the county showing the tow vendor's business license lapsed in April. I requested copies of every enforcement notice I received and matched them to the timestamps. I built a comparison photo set showing multiple cars parked the same way with 0 fines. I documented every interaction with Joan and printed the email with the midnight deadline. Joan did not stay quiet. She filed a lien threat that includes bogus legal fees and an invented enforcement surcharge. The letter arrived in certified mail. It said I owed $2,300 for accumulated violations, obstruction, and administrative processing. If I did not pay within 10 days, they would record a lien and add attorney fees. I took the letter to Marcy. She said, "This is retaliation. She is trying to scare you into paying before the meeting. Do not pay. Bring this to the board. If they vote to approve the lien, we will take it to court." I said, "What if they vote with her?" Marcy said, "Then we file an injunction and expose the expired vendor contract in public record. Either way, she loses." I kept recording. Joan started showing up at my house. She would walk past my driveway slowly, holding her handheld scanner, letting it beep. She did this 3 times a day. I recorded every pass. One morning she stopped and said, "Tick-tock." I said, "Excuse me." She said, 10 days. Then the lien. I said, "See you at the meeting." She smiled and said, "I have a board vote screenshot, but I am not showing it to anyone but my ally." She walked away. The side complication was that Joan claimed she has a board vote screenshot but refuses to show it to anyone but her ally. That ally was the HOA treasurer. His name was Dennis. He sent me an email saying the lien was approved pending my response. I replied asking for the vote record. He said it was internal. I asked for the meeting minutes. He said they were not finalized. I asked when they would be finalized. He did not reply. Marcy said, "They are stalling because there was no vote. Joan is making it up. If you force them to produce the minutes at the public meeting, they will either admit there was no vote or fabricate one on the spot. Either way, it is leverage. I said, what if they kick me out of the meeting? Marcy said they cannot. HOA meetings are member meetings. You are a member. They have to let you speak. The meeting was on a Wednesday at 7. I arrived at 6:30 with my folder, my printed evidence, and Marcy. The clubhouse was set up with folding chairs facing a long table. Joan sat at the center with Dennis on her left and 2 other board members on her right. A small camera on a tripod pointed at the table. Joan saw me and smiled. The meeting started with routine business. Budget updates, landscaping bids, pool maintenance schedules. I waited. At 7:45, they opened the floor for owner comments. I stood. Joan said, name and address. I gave both. She said, you have 3 minutes. I said, I need more than 3. She said, 3 minutes is policy. I said, then I am using all 3. If you are enjoying this HOA nightmare, hit like and subscribe for more stories where the rules backfire. I started with the lien threat. I said, I received a certified letter claiming I owe $2,300 for parking violations and administrative fees. The violations are based on rules that do not exist in the CC and Rs. The fees are based on a vendor contract that expired in April. I have documentation. Joan interrupted. She said, you were notified multiple times. I said, I was notified with fake rules 15 minutes before a fake deadline. Joan said, the board approved those rules. I said, show me the minutes. Dennis started shuffling papers. Joan said, the minutes are being finalized. I said, you told me there was a board vote. If there was a vote, there are minutes. Joan said, we voted in executive session. I said, executive session votes are not valid for enforcement policy. That has to be an open session. Marcy stood up and said, she is right. Florida HOA statute requires open meetings for rule changes. One of the other board members leaned over and whispered to Joan. She nodded. She said, we will table this until next month. I said, no. You sent me a lien threat with a 10-day deadline. That deadline is in 4 days. You do not get to table it. Joan said, this is not the time. I said, this is exactly the time. I pulled out the comparison photo set, showing multiple cars parked the same way with 0 fines. I passed copies to the board. I said, these are photos from your neighborhood. Same temp tags, same guest passes, same parking. None of them got fined. Only me. Joan said, those are different cases. I said, how? She did not answer. Marcy said, we also have the vendor contract records. The tow company you have been using lost their business license in April. Every tow authorization since then is invalid. If any resident was towed under that contract, they can sue the HOA and you personally. Dennis looked at Joan. He said, is that true? Joan said, the contract auto-renews. Marcy said, not if the vendor is unlicensed. Dennis said, we need to verify this. Joan said, I will handle it. I said, you have been handling it. That is the problem. I pulled out my phone. I said, I also have recordings. Joan said, recordings are not allowed in HOA meetings. I said, this is not from a meeting. This is from my driveway. I played the clip in the meeting so Joan cannot talk over her own voice. The audio was clear. Joan saying, your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead. Joan saying, I have all day, and so does my fine meter. Joan saying, you are preventing access to a non-compliant vehicle. That is obstruction. The room went silent. One of the board members said, what is this? I said, this is your welcome committee chair threatening me with fake violations and using an expired vendor contract to intimidate residents. The board member looked at Joan. He said, Joan. She said, he is twisting it. The board member said, it is on tape. Marcy said, we are also filing a complaint with the county and the state contractor board. If the board votes to proceed with the lien, we will file an injunction and request an audit of every enforcement action Joan has taken in the past year. If other residents were targeted the same way, this becomes a class action. Joan stood up. She said, you cannot threaten the board. Marcy said, I am not threatening. I am informing. Joan said, this is out of order. Marcy said, no, this is exactly in order. You filed a fraudulent lien threat. You used an unlicensed vendor. You invented rules. You selectively enforced them. That is misconduct. Dennis said, we need to take a recess. Joan said, no, we are voting. Dennis said, Joan, sit down. She sat. He said, we cannot vote on a lien if the enforcement actions are under dispute. We need to review everything. Joan said, I have a board vote screenshot. Dennis said, then show it. She did not move. The board member on the right said, I do not remember voting on any midnight enforcement rule. The board member on the left said, neither do I. Dennis said, Joan, did we vote on this? Joan said, yes. Dennis said, when? Joan said, executive session. Dennis said, we have not had an executive session in 3 months. Joan did not answer. Marcy said, this is fraud, plain and simple. If you proceed with the lien, every board member is liable. If you void it now and retract the enforcement actions, you limit your exposure. The choice is yours. Dennis looked at Joan. He said, we are voiding the lien. Joan said, you cannot do that. Dennis said, yes, I can. I am the treasurer. The lien requires my signature. I am not signing it. Joan said, the board approved it. Dennis said, no, we did not. You said we did. That is different. Joan stood up again. She said, I am filing a formal complaint. Dennis said, file whatever you want. This meeting is over. Joan grabbed her papers and walked out. The door slammed behind her. Dennis looked at me and said, I apologize. We will issue a retraction letter within 48 hours. All fines are void. The vendor contract is terminated. If you incurred any costs, submit receipts, and we will reimburse you. Marcy said, we also want a policy change. No enforcement actions without board approval in open session. Dennis said, agreed. We will put that on next month's agenda. I sat down. Marcy leaned over and said, that was perfect. You let her talk herself into a corner and then played her own words back. I said, I learned from you. The retraction letter arrived 2 days later. It voided every fine, every fee, and every enforcement action Joan had issued. It also included a formal apology and a note that the welcome committee structure was under review. I framed it. But Joan was not done. A week later, I got a call from Marcy. She said, Joan is filing a board election challenge that flips the power dynamic. She is trying to remove Dennis and install her ally. If she wins, she is back in control. I said, can she do that? Marcy said, technically, yes. Any member can call for a special election if they get 10% of owners to sign a petition. Joan has been going door to door. I said, what do we do? Marcy said, counter petition. If you get more signatures, you can block her petition and propose your own slate. I said, I do not know anyone in this neighborhood. Marcy said, you know me. And I know 20 people who hate Joan. Let me make some calls. Marcy organized a neighborhood meeting at her house. 15 people showed up. Every one of them had a Joan story. One woman said Joan fined her for having a purple front door. Another said Joan tried to tow her landscaper's truck. A man said Joan threatened him with a lien because his trash can was visible from the street on a non-collection day. I took notes. We drafted a counter petition. The goal was to recall Joan from the welcome committee and replace her with a member-elected volunteer position. We needed 30 signatures. We got 42 in 3 days. I submitted the petition to Dennis. He said, this is going to get ugly. I said, it already is. Joan found out. She showed up at my house the next morning. She said, you think you can remove me? I said, I think the neighborhood can. She said, I have been on this board for 3 years. I built the compliance program. I know every rule. I said, you made up the rules. She said, I enforced the rules. I said, with an expired vendor and fake deadlines. She said, you twisted that. I said, it is on tape. She said, your paperwork is cute. Mine has a letterhead. I said, not anymore. She turned and walked away. I called Marcy. I said, she is going to escalate. Marcy said, let her. The more she escalates, the more evidence we have. Just keep recording. Joan escalated. She filed a formal complaint with the board claiming I was harassing her. The complaint said I followed her, recorded her without consent, and made false accusations in a public meeting. Dennis forwarded me a copy and said, "This is nonsense, but I have to investigate." I said, "Investigate away. I have recordings of every interaction." Dennis said, "Send them to me." I sent everything: the driveway videos, the audio clips, the photos, the emails. Dennis reviewed it all and sent a one-line reply: "Complaint dismissed." Joan replied to his email with a 10-paragraph rebuttal. Dennis did not respond. The special election was scheduled for 6 weeks out. Joan spent the time campaigning. She went door to door with a printed flyer, no readable text, just bold shapes and a photo of the clubhouse. She told people I was trying to dismantle the HOA enforcement program and turn the neighborhood into a free-for-all. Marcy spent the time organizing. She set up a website, printed her own flyers, and hosted 2 more neighborhood meetings. The message was simple: no more fake rules. No more selective enforcement. No more fear tactics. The vote was on a Saturday. The clubhouse was packed. Joan sat at the front table with her ally. Dennis sat on the opposite side with Marcy and me. The board president read the petition language. "Recall Joan from Welcome Committee Chair. Replace with member-elected volunteer position." He said, "All in favor." 47 hands went up. He said, "Opposed." 8 hands. He said, "Motion carries." Joan stood. She said, "This is illegal." The president said, "No, it is not." Joan said, "I am filing an appeal." The president said, "File it. You are still removed." Joan grabbed her papers and walked out. Her ally stayed seated. He did not say a word. Marcy was elected as the new volunteer coordinator. Her first act was to rescind every enforcement rule Joan had created. Her second act was to publish the full vendor contract history and issue refunds to every resident who had been fined under the expired contract. 7 people got checks. The total was $4,000. The HOA paid it out of the reserve fund. I thought it was over. It was not. Joan filed a lawsuit. She claimed the recall was invalid because the petition did not follow proper notice procedures. She asked for an injunction to reverse the vote and reinstate her position. Marcy said, "She is going to lose, but we have to respond." I said, "How much?" Marcy said, "Probably $5,000 in legal fees." I said, "I will pay it." Marcy said, "You do not have to. The HOA is paying." Dennis approved it. The lawsuit dragged for 2 months. Joan's attorney argued that the petition was defective because it did not include a specific recall date in the original filing. Our attorney argued that the recall followed the procedures outlined in the CC&Rs and that Joan's removal was valid. The judge reviewed everything and issued a ruling. Petition is valid. Recall stands. Case dismissed. Joan is forced to retract her claim in writing. The retraction was 1 sentence. I acknowledge the recall was conducted in accordance with Hidden Creek Reserve Association governing documents. She signed it and filed it with the court. Marcy framed it and hung it in the clubhouse next to my voided lien letter. But I still wanted the bigger payoff. The trump card. I had been holding it since the driveway confrontation. A certified mail trail proving they received my compliance proof and fined me anyway. I had sent a certified packet to the HOA office the same day Joan issued the first violation. The packet included my temp tag, my insurance, my deed, and a notarized residency affidavit. I had the tracking receipt showing it was delivered and signed for. Joan signed for it. 2 days later, she issued the second violation and the lien threat. I did not show that receipt at the first board meeting. I waited. I wanted to use it when it mattered most. That moment came when Joan's lawsuit was dismissed, and she filed a second complaint with the county claiming the HOA board violated open meeting laws during the recall vote. The county sent an investigator. The investigator scheduled a hearing. Joan claimed the recall meeting was not properly noticed and that votes were cast by non-members. The hearing was at the county building. Joan showed up with her attorney. Marcy and I showed up with Dennis and our attorney. The investigator asked Joan to present her evidence. She pulled out a folder and said, "The meeting notice was posted only 5 days in advance. Code requires 7. She also said 3 people who voted were not registered owners. The investigator said, "Do you have proof?" Joan said, "I have affidavits." The investigator said, "From who?" Joan said, "Anonymous residents." The investigator said, "Anonymous affidavits are not evidence." Our attorney stood. He said, "We have counter evidence. The meeting notice was posted 9 days in advance. Here is the dated receipt from the posting service." He handed the investigator a document. He said, "We also have the signed voter roll. Every person who voted provided ID and proof of ownership." Joan said, "That is not true." Our attorney said, "Then let's review the roll." He handed the investigator a second document. I stood. I said, "I also have something." I pulled out the certified mail receipt. I said, "This is proof that Joan received my compliance documents 2 days before she issued the lien threat. She fined me for non-compliance after I had already complied." The investigator took the receipt. He said, "When was this sent?" I said, 3 weeks before the first board meeting." He looked at Joan. He said, "Did you receive this?" Joan said, "I do not recall." The investigator said, "It is signed by you." Joan said nothing. The investigator said, "This is fraud. You fined a resident for a violation that did not exist." Joan said, "He did not follow the correct procedure." The investigator said, "He sent certified mail with proof of delivery. That is the correct procedure." Joan said, "I was enforcing HOA policy." The investigator said, "You were enforcing a policy you invented. That is not the same thing." Our attorney said, "We are requesting a formal finding of misconduct and a recommendation that the HOA be released from any liability related to Joan's enforcement actions." The investigator said, "I will issue a report within 10 days. Joan stood and said, "This is biased." The investigator said, "This is evidence-based." Joan walked out. The report came back in 8 days. It found that Joan had engaged in selective enforcement, falsified vendor authorizations, and issued fines without proper board approval. It recommended that the HOA implement oversight procedures for all future enforcement actions, and that Joan be permanently barred from any enforcement role within the association. The HOA board voted unanimously to adopt the recommendations. The HOA pays the narrator's filing fees to end the fight. Dennis sent me a check for $1,200 covering my legal costs, certified mail fees, and the cost of the recordings. But the final move happened in a hardware store parking lot. I was loading mulch into my truck when I saw Joan's car pull in. She parked 3 spots over. I ignored her. She got out and walked toward the entrance. A tow truck pulled in behind her. The driver got out and walked up to her car. He looked at the plate, looked at a slip of paper, and pulled out a wheel clamp. I walked over. I said, "What is going on?" The driver said, "Unpaid towing fees." Joan came running out of the store. She said, "What are you doing?" The driver said, "You owe us $1,100 for 3 tows we completed under your authorization. Your HOA voided the contract, so the fees revert to you personally." Joan said, "That is not legal." The driver said, "It is in the contract you signed. Section 12. Joan said, "I did not sign anything." The driver pulled out a folder and showed her a signature page. Joan stared at it. She said, "I will pay you next week." The driver said, "No. I have been trying to collect for 2 months. Your car is immobilized until you pay." Joan said, "I need my car." The driver said, "Then pay." Joan said, "I do not have $1,100 on me." The driver said, "There is an ATM inside." Joan looked at me. I smiled. I said, "I have all day, and so does my fine meter." Joan walked back into the store. The driver finished clamping the wheel. He said, "She has 2 hours before I tow it to impound. If she does not pay by then, she owes storage fees too." I said, "How much?" He said, $50 a day. I said, "That is going to add up." He said, "That is the idea." Joan came back out 20 minutes later with cash. She handed it to the driver. He counted it, wrote a receipt, and removed the clamp. Joan got in her car and drove away without looking at me. The driver said, "She is done." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We flagged her account. If she ever tries to authorize another tow through any vendor in the county, we will get notified. She cannot do this again." I called Marcy. I said, "It is over." Marcy said, "What happened?" I told her. She laughed. She said, "Karma." I said, her own clip proves the opposite of her claim. Marcy said, what? I said, at the first confrontation, she said her word was the paperwork. But the certified mail receipt proved I had paperwork and she ignored it. Her own rule destroyed her defense. Marcy said, that is poetic. I said, that is evidence. Marcy said, same thing. A month later, the HOA held a vote on a new enforcement policy. The policy required board approval for any fine over $25, prohibited selective enforcement, and required quarterly audits of all vendor contracts. It passed unanimously. Joan did not attend the meeting. I saw her one more time. She was walking past my driveway with a dog. She did not have the scanner. She did not have the radio. She did not have the badge clip. She looked at my car, looked at me, and kept walking. I waved. She did not wave back. Marcy said, you won. I said, we won. Marcy said, fair. I said, what happens to Joan now? Marcy said, nothing. She is still a resident. She still votes. She just cannot enforce anything. I said, good. Marcy said, you sound relieved. I said, I am. I moved here to sell houses, not fight wars. Marcy said, welcome to HOA life. The enforcement policy went into effect the following month. The first audit flagged 2 more expired vendor contracts and 3 enforcement actions that had never been board approved. All 3 were voided. The HOA issued refunds. Marcy sent me a copy of the audit report with a note. This is what accountability looks like. I still live in Hidden Creek Reserve. I still park in my driveway. I still have a temp tag in the windshield sometimes when I am moving cars for clients. No one bothers me. No one leaves stickers. No one calls vendors. The neighborhood is quiet. Joan still lives here too. I see her at the pool sometimes. She does not talk to me. She does not talk to Marcy. She does not talk to Dennis. She sits alone with a book and leaves when other people arrive. Marcy said, that is sad. I said, that is consequences. A few months ago, a new family moved in across the street. They parked a moving truck in the driveway for 2 days. On the 3rd day, they got a notice. It was not from Joan. It was from the new compliance coordinator, a retired teacher named Angela. The notice said the truck was blocking the sidewalk and needed to be moved within 24 hours, or the HOA would file a county obstruction complaint. The family moved the truck that afternoon. Angela stopped by to thank them and welcome them to the neighborhood. That is how enforcement is supposed to work. I sold 3 houses in Hidden Creek this year. Every buyer asked about the HOA. I told them the truth. It was a nightmare. It got fixed. It is better now. 2 of them bought anyway. 1 walked. I do not blame them. Marcy is running for the board next year. She asked me to run with her. I said no. I said I do not have time. She said, you have time to fight Joan for 6 months, but you do not have time to prevent the next Joan. I said, fair point. I am thinking about it. Dennis stepped down as treasurer last month. He said he was tired. He said 3 years of Joan was enough. He said the new board can handle it. Marcy said, you did good. Dennis said, I just signed the checks. Marcy said, you signed the right checks. Dennis said, that is all it takes sometimes. The HOA is stable now. The reserve fund is healthy. The vendor contracts are current. The enforcement policy is working. No one is getting fined for fake violations. No one is getting towed by unlicensed vendors. No one is afraid to park in their own driveway. That is a win. I still have the voided lien letter framed in my office. Clients ask about it. I tell them the story. Some of them laugh, some of them wince. One of them said, I would have just paid the fine. I said, that is what they count on. He said, what do you mean? I said, they count on you being too tired, too scared, or too busy to fight. If you pay, they win. If you fight, they lose. He said, even if it costs you time and money. I said, especially then, because the next person does not have to fight as hard. He bought a house in Hidden Creek. He said, if the HOA tries anything, I am calling you. I said, call Marcy. She is better at this than I am. He said, you won, did you not? I said, we won. He said, same thing. I said, not really. He said, close enough. Joan's term on the board ends next year. She is not running for re-election. Marcy said, good riddance. I said she might come back. Marcy said, not if we do this right. I said, what does that mean? Marcy said, it means we build a system that does not need heroes. It just needs rules that work and people who follow them. I said, that is a good campaign slogan. Marcy said, I know. I am voting for her. I might even run with her. I have not decided yet. But I know one thing. I am not afraid of the HOA anymore. I am not afraid of fake rules. I am not afraid of expired vendor contracts. I am not afraid of people like Joan. Because I know how to fight now. And I know I am not alone. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.